Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the great privilege of being the president of this extraordinary institution, Hunter College. It is a privilege tonight to welcome back our friends from the Aspen Institute and to again celebrate the legacy of an extraordinary New Yorker, Preston Robert Tisch. We are really gratified also to have his wonderful daughter, Lori, and his phenomenal son, Jonathan, with us tonight. Also great friends of Hunter College and wonderful New York citizens in their own right. I can't be certain, but today may be the first time that two former governors have held a public conversation in the house of a third. How fitting to have Mario Cuomo and Christine Todd Whitman in the home of Franklin Roosevelt, all among the best governors we've had. Governors Cuomo and Whitman have both been visiting professors at Hunter College, inspiring many students to careers in public service. So it is a great honor to welcome them home today to Roosevelt House and Hunter College. To Roosevelt House, of course, the house that FDR's mother, Sarah, built in 1908 as a wedding gift for the newlyweds, Franklin and Eleanor. There was one stipulation, however. Sarah kept half of the house for herself. That may have been the first New Deal. You can tell by the layout that Sarah was not too fussy about the distinction between her half and the newlyweds' half. As Eleanor was fond of saying, you were never quite sure where Sarah would appear, day or night. So if any of you think you have mother-in-law issues, you have some competition. It was no wonder that Eleanor often found herself walking a few blocks uptown to spend some time with the Hunter students and get out of the house. A long and rich relationship developed between the Roosevelts and the Hunter community and lasted even after they left 65th Street for the White House. After Sarah died in 1941, the family arranged for Hunter to purchase the house. Franklin himself donated the first $1,000, and Eleanor attended the dedication and remained an active friend of Hunter's till her death. For many years, this house was a popular student activity center. But when I became president in 2001, I was dismayed to discover the house long closed and in desperate need of repair. We were determined to have it faithfully restored and have so thrilled to welcome you all tonight to see that we've made this dream a reality. The building is rich in the history of one of the most important families of the 20th century. Stories come alive as we walk through the rooms where FDR recovered from polio and where Louis Howe moved in to help him get his career back on track. Howe's hard work paid off, but it didn't look that way the night they waited at the Biltmore Hotel for the results of the 1928 governor's race. They came home to this house thinking that Franklin had lost. It wasn't until 4 in the morning on the radio in a room upstairs that the numbers had shifted and that FDR was elected the 44th governor of New York. 4 years later, and exactly 68 years ago today, which is very thrilling to be doing this program, FDR again came home from the Biltmore on election night, but this time he greeted Sarah on the steps as the newly elected president, with her telling him, "This is the happiest day of my life." That same day, he sat in the parlor room upstairs, thanking the electorate and discussing his economic recovery plan over NBC radio. And 3 months later, in his library, right upstairs again, he convinced Frances Perkins to become the first woman cabinet member in U.S. history after he agreed to allow her to create the program we still know as Social Security. So all this extraordinary history happened in this house, and the room that you're now sitting in is one of the only changes that we made. This was the backyard. You are sitting where there used to be dirt. All of that dirt was taken out. Can't you get a backhoe in the backyard of a New York City townhouse? All taken out with shovels by hand out the front door onto 65th Street and then around the corner to Park Avenue where you could keep a dumpster because you can't put one on the 65th Street through street. So this was quite a labor of love, and we are so happy to welcome all of you here tonight to enjoy the home. And to welcome you, invite you back in a few weeks on November 15th when Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, will be officially cutting the ribbon. The reopening of Roosevelt House as the home of our new public policy has made all of this wait worthwhile. The goal of the Institute is to honor the legacy of the Roosevelts and their commitment to equality and opportunity for all. Mario Cuomo and Christine Todd Whitman are living embodiments of that commitment, as are the members of the Aspen Institute, who share our aim of fostering intelligent and open discussion and finding solutions to today's most pressing issues. So it is now my pleasure to introduce one of Aspen's great leaders, the Vice President and a Vice President of the Aspen Institute, former U.S. Congressman Mickey Edwards. Congressman Edwards served as a representative from Oklahoma for 16 years before going on to teach at Harvard and Princeton. He's become a renowned political commentator and author, and currently writes for The Atlantic and runs the Aspen Institute's leadership program for elected officials. Let us welcome a great public servant, Congressman Edwards.
Dr. Rabb, thank you very much, and thank you to Hunter. This is a beautiful, beautiful facility. What you've done here is really terrific. My only job here is to thank you all for coming, to welcome you on behalf of the Aspen Institute. I do want to say there could not be a more fitting kind of a program for this time, right after our elections, and the Tisches have really done something very, very wonderful by allowing us to have this continuing series of programs. This one in particular, the title, as you have seen in your program, is about leadership in crisis. Fortunately, we have a couple of examples here of people whose leadership was not crisis, but leadership we could be very proud of. Let me just say, in welcoming them, they're talking about restoring faith in American politics and American politicians. When we started the Rodell program at the Aspen Institute, which was to reach out to emerging young political leaders in this country of both parties, completely bipartisan way, to focus on values and principles, the first thing I had to do was to put together an advisory board. Where do you look for the kinds of people who would be the examples that we wanted to hold out to these new people rising up to high public office? So two of the very first people I went to who agreed to be on the Aspen Rodell board were Mario Cuomo and Todd Whitman. And they have set a real pattern here for us to see our young political leaders follow. It's going to be, I'm going to make it a personal note when I introduce Brian Lehrer. Those of you who live in New York full-time don't need to have any introduction to Brian Lehrer. His radio program on WNYC is extremely popular. His radio program, his television program, won a Peabody Award for promoting radio and programs that unite rather than divide, which makes you the hero of the moment, Brian. And the personal note was I had the experience a couple of years ago of writing a book. When you write a book, you try to make it sell. It's not always easy, but fortunately I was invited to be on the Brian Lehrer Show, and since everybody listens to the show, for at least a short time, my book sold very well. Brian, thank you very much. Brian Lehrer.
I never got my royalty check. Thank you, and I appreciate the Aspen Institute inviting me to moderate this discussion with the two distinguished governors whose experience and expertise can certainly help us in these very challenging times. Please welcome Governor Mario Cuomo and Governor Christie Whitman. And I guess history is repeating itself. New York once again has a governor named Cuomo, and New Jersey once again has a governor named Christie. And we will talk a bit this evening about some specific. I'm glad you like that. My wife told me not to use it. We will talk a bit this evening about some specifics of New York and New Jersey, and of course their current generation of governors. But the title of this event is Leadership in Crisis: Restoring Confidence in American Politics and Politicians. And I just want to say a brief word about it to set it up. This confidence deficit is a bipartisan problem. President Obama's approval ratings are down to 45% or so. President Bush left office with approval in the low 30s. Vice President Cheney in the 20s in some polls. In September, in a Gallup poll, approval of the Democrats in Congress was just 33%. Approval of Republicans in Congress at 32%, so a statistical tie. The Tea Party was born, as I think we all know, to challenge leadership in both parties. Now, a Gallup poll of confidence in institutions this summer, and it measured all kinds of institutions, found that confidence in Congress as an institution was at 11%, which is the lowest of any institution that Gallup has measured at any time in the 37 years that they have been asking that question. That's Congress. Luckily for the New York and New Jersey state legislatures, I couldn't find those numbers. So let's talk about it. And audience, if you have an immediate follow-up question as we're talking up here, feel free to raise your hand and maybe we'll be able to call on you to deepen the conversation, or we can just wait for questions until the end, but I'm going to kind of leave that up to you. If you want to follow up, feel free to raise your hand. So Governor Whitman, do you think confidence in our political leaders and institutions is in crisis? And if so, how would you begin to answer why?
Well, confidence certainly is in crisis. Those statistics prove it, and it's not surprising. I mean, the Tea Party movement, they keep calling it a party. It's not a party, it's a movement. And it has people from both sides. I've talked to people who voted for Obama as well as people who voted for George Bush who just said, we're fed up. Neither party is addressing the issues, and we don't like what Congress is doing, which is not much of anything. Although, unfortunately, part of what people are looking for with the new Congress, they think it wouldn't be a bad thing to have gridlock. That's a nice thought if you don't like what Congress was doing. The problem is this country has some very serious issues that need to be addressed, and we cannot afford to have gridlock. That's not where we want to be. But the first thing, I get this question a lot, what can you do? And the first thing is people have to look in the mirror. Because quite frankly, this is a democracy, and the place where change starts is with us. We're the only ones who can do it. And whether you like the Tea Party or don't like the Tea Party, it did get people engaged who hadn't been before. The voter turnout in this election was about 40%. Now that's a miserable number, but it's up from what it usually is when Congress is the top of the ticket. It's usually about 32%. And that tells us where part of the problem is. The part of the problem is we don't engage enough, and we don't engage in a regular enough period. We'll go out and vote and think, gee, we've done a great job because we actually voted and it was cloudy out, so I made a big sacrifice to go and vote. But that's it. Then we don't engage any further if we could take it that far. And we have to understand it starts with us. Because if we keep re-electing people, if the re-election rate stays the way it's been in many states, and obviously this time around we saw some changes, people were finally figuring it out, the power of the ballot box. If we don't do that, if we keep re-electing them, we're just reaffirming the behavior that we say we don't like. And so what I hope is that after this election, one of the messages that people have to continue to send to Congress, and Lord knows it's easy enough to communicate these days, is to tell the leadership that what they don't want is 2 years of either trying to make sure that Barack Obama doesn't get reelected president, so all you want to do is have hearings and stop everything, or on the other side saying what really messed us up was the blue dog Democrats because they didn't let us go far enough to the left, and we're going to spend the rest of the time trying to marginalize them. We've got to continue to send that message, though. It's up to us. If we don't do it, nobody else is going to.
And Governor Cuomo, where would you begin?
You want to restate the question, please?
Sorry.
The question being why leadership in politics, confidence in leadership in politics and government is in crisis.
The crisis is in people's minds. They're reacting to what's happening to them in their own life. I think to get a real perspective here, you ought to think back to the last time we had a government that succeeded. And it wasn't so long ago. As a matter of fact, it was so fresh still in my mind that I'm shocked people haven't talked more about it. In the beginning of the 21st century, you had a very good governor in New Jersey, and she's with us tonight, and you had Bill Clinton. I nominated him in 1992. His first year was 1993. If you go back to his period, 1993 until 2001, they produced 22 million new jobs, an upwardly mobile middle class, a shrinking poor population, the best years of market in the history of the United States of America, and left with a potential surplus of $5.4 trillion. Now, I think There was question about that number. But it's an astoundingly successful story. If you look much more closely, you find out that Clinton did very poorly in his first term. And as a matter of fact, midterm, he was about where Obama was in popularity. So was Reagan, incidentally, midterm for him. So now the perspective begins changing. What is it that they did that we can't do? They collaborated. He got together with Gingrich and with the Republicans. Why? Because he had to. In the beginning, he had a Democratic Congress with him. By the time he got to the end of his term, the Congress was all dominated by Republicans. And so he thought up this interesting idea called triangulation. He didn't call it that, but all it was old-fashioned bargaining and collaborating. That's what we need most of all, is getting people who are intelligent about being able to compromise. As some of the people now are talking, I think it's mostly Republicans, but certainly not exclusively, are talking about conceding that they would have to cooperate and give something up in their position is sinful. I mean, I hear some Republicans saying, in effect, we won't do a damn thing for this president. Why? Because we want to have the presidency. And so their whole mission appears to be, at the moment, for them not to make the country better, not to do something about too many people in prison and not enough people graduating from high school and colleges, not about the middle class shrinking and the poor population growing, which it has by 6 million people over the last several years. What they're talking about is just stymieing the situation so that the Democrats can't take credit for any progress. That's an absurdity. It's a sin. It's a political sin. But unfortunately, there's no way to force them to a different point of view. So where are we? We should not be surprised at what happened in the election. Why? Because after the Clinton years, which were magnificent, very quickly a whole series of things happened that made people suffer and made them frightened. Well, what happened? Immediately it was 9/11. Now that's the beginning of the new century. 9/11 happened, and we're still living with 9/11 and the wars that came out of it. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the war against terrorism, which is a war against people who don't wear uniforms and don't live in any one place, but are all over the globe now, dressed in their own attire like everybody else, but ready to give up their own lives to get yours. Now, that's one of the problems. At the same time, we had an economy that suddenly weakened. Starting in 2007, they say the recession. 2008, Obama is elected. Everybody is up. Expectations are high. It's a wonderful, glorious new moment. But what was getting worse and worse at that time was the economy. Well, now, why did the economy get bad? Well, for a lot of reasons. We spent too much money. We gave the biggest tax cuts in history, even bigger than the Reagan tax cuts, when we didn't need that because we had deficit problems already. And the recession got stronger and stronger. Ironically, something that is held against the current president was a helpful device very early on. Bush thought up the bailouts. If it weren't for the bailouts, we really would have been in trouble. And Obama agreed with President Bush in the bailouts and joined with him a collaboration. And if you look very closely, the bailouts worked beautifully. And the money is back, and it was a hell of a good deal. You can't convince the American people of that. So in a nutshell, why are they opposed? Why are the people saying that the leadership is lousy, et cetera? It's because of their lives. Their middle-class people are getting closer and closer to being poor people. The rich people are doing very, very well, and that makes it even worse psychologically, that the rich are getting richer while they're getting poorer. The banks survive very nicely, thank you. A couple of them went down, but for the most part, Wall Street's not suffering. They are. They're without jobs. That's a terrible, terrible thing. to be. They're without hope in a lot of cases. Only 70% of their children are getting through high school in a world where if you're not high skilled, you have very little chance to compete in making things. We have, if you want a really strong economy, you have to do what you did the first time around to be, it's the biggest economy, but to be the greatest economy. And what was that? We made everything that counted, the big stuff, the heavy stuff, the steel stuff. We made it and sold it to the rest of the world. And if they needed money to buy it, we lent them the money. Doesn't that sound familiar? Yeah, that's where China is now. Now we don't make anything. We
Governor,
buy everything from China.
If I could jump in for just a minute, and I know Governor Whitman wants to respond to something that you said, but are you saying that the reason that government is perceived to be failing is because objective conditions that are out of their control are bad or not as good as they were? Is that letting them off the hook too much?
No, it's not out of their control. I mean, these forces are not out of the control of the government. They choose to not to collaborate. And if you don't collaborate, then you get this problem because you can't agree on cures. There were about 400 bills that the Democrats passed that they couldn't get the Republicans to deal with. 400. Will that happen again? Well, if it happens again in this new go-around, then the problems will be uncurable. And if that's true, the country will go into a deeper ditch than it's in now. But no, it's wrong, I think, to say that this was uncontrollable. How did Clinton do it? How did he get it done? He's a very smart guy, but he's not a genius, and he's not a magician. He did it the old-fashioned way by getting them to collaborate. And he had Republicans who did it with him. Republicans who agreed, for example, on a pay-as-you-go plan that helped with the spending. Incidentally, one other thing, just to confuse us a little bit more profoundly. Another thing that's gone wrong, I think, with our politics is our misunderstanding, the people's misunderstanding. I want to agree with Governor Whitman on the people were at fault for a lot of this, too. You had three burst balloons. One of them was subprime mortgages. Well, whose fault was that? Well, it was bankers who lied. It was appraisers who lied. It was a whole string of people who lied. It was securitization that covered the lies. And it was people who knew that they couldn't afford the house they were buying. And people who fell in love with their credit cards and overspent. And so the public has a problem, too. Bottom line, the government is failing. The government has failed to cure the current problem, and so the people are angry, the people are frightened, and the people don't like the government. It happens a lot. It happened in 1994. And they did exactly what they did a couple of weeks ago or last week, whatever it was. It's very simple. But it can be better. And that's the Clinton years experience. And I think we should be concentrating more on that.
We'll see what happens over the next couple of years if it repeats after 1994. Governor Whitman?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with Governor Cuomo in saying that compromise is what helped make us better and stronger as a country. I'm not sure I'd go quite as far as saying the Clinton years were all the halcyon days, but I can remember that when one of the things that happened on welfare reform, which is a big undertaking during the Clinton years, is the governors came down. And the governors came down and they spent time with the Congress and we spent time with the president. There was a small group of us that did it on a regular basis to get the compromises. The president vetoed the bill twice and finally was in a position where he just couldn't do it a third time, and that compromise was born. But again, it's both sides of the aisle. I can remember when I went for my courtesy meetings before my confirmation hearing at EPA, and I met with a lot of Democrats who said, you know, we're just waiting. We're waiting to see what you guys do wrong, because we know you're going to do wrong. And the American people get let down when there's that attitude. For instance, very early on, the president sent a bill to the Hill that would have put, for the first time, a cap on mercury emissions. It was a 3-pollutant bill. Neither side wanted to discuss it, and the Democrats particularly made it they wouldn't allow it to go forward. They made it into a political time bomb. So unfortunately, there are problems on both sides of the aisle. This is not just one party. We've gotten into this habit of looking at every issue through the partisan political prism, not the policy prism. It is what is going to get me another vote in my caucus, what's going to get me a bigger plurality in my election, not about what's really solving this problem. And I see it again and again. And a classic example of how bad and pervasive this political attitude has gotten came when we, early on, we did a regulation on non-road diesel engines. Those are backhoes and tractors and things, which actually are more problematic for human health than their on-road cousins, the buses and trucks and things. And we put together the environmental community with the manufacturers of the engines, with the government people. And we actually hammered out a regulation that reduced the pollutants by 90%. It's currently in force. It's happening now. We've reduced those pollutants by 90%. Well, the NRDC, which is one of the largest and most respected of the environmental groups in Washington, said and put out a statement that said that this is possibly the best thing for human health since we've taken lead out of gasoline. I thought that was really great because it showed we can bring the disparate people together, we can actually work in good faith and get something done. Well, 2 days later, I opened the Washington Post to see that the other environmental groups were apoplectic at the NRDC for having given us this quote. They demanded they take it back. Actually, the executive director almost lost his job because they said it would hamper their ability to attack the president's otherwise far from perfect record in the environment. And with a day after that, I got a letter from the NRDC saying, well, we've looked at the Clean Air Act, and maybe there's something else that's more important, so please stop using the quote. Well, the problem is when it's gotten that deep. I mean, here was a regulation we crafted for them. We made a lot of changes to it because they had very legitimate concerns to what had originally come through. If you can't even, when it's something that you have worked on and you got what you wanted in it, and it was a good regulation, if you can't even give credit at that level, it gets very hard when you get to the hard issues. I can't remember, and Governor, I don't know whether you remember or Mickey, you remember a time when you had a major issue facing the country, and this is the issue of immigration. You had an administration bill, a Senate bill, and a House bill. And what happens then is you appoint a conference committee and you iron out the differences. They never even appointed the conference committee. Why? It was an election year, and each side wanted that issue to beat up the other side. And both sides were culpable on this, and now real people are being hurt. And that's where we've got to stand up and say, enough of this already. This is about people. You've got to separate some of these issues from the politics and look at the policy and what's right for the people.
So, Governor Whitman, do you think it's worse today than when you were in office as governor or even as EPA administrator, but particularly in your days as governor? I mean, it's easy to forget that in the late 90s, President Clinton was being impeached, and everybody was running around saying they've never seen polarization like that. Now people in Washington, I think I hear them saying quite frequently, it is even worse. Do you think it is?
I think it's even worse, yes. I mean, when you have people saying after the election that the thing we're going to do in the next 2 years is make sure Barack Obama doesn't get elected, and the other side saying, well, we're really going to go after the blue dog Democrats because it's their fault we lost the election because they wouldn't let us go far enough to the left, you're creating a situation, in this country it was taken for granted that Republicans ran to the right during primaries and Democrats to the left, and then they both ran back to the middle when the election, for the general election. And that worked when the right was here and the left was here. But when the right's out there and the left's out there, you can't come back to anything that looks like the middle at all. And that makes it very hard to compromise. And the other thing that's changed, just the last little thing that's changed, is we now look at all these issues as a moral issue. I mean, it's moral. And if you think about it, if you have a moral position and someone disagrees with you, you're not just disagreeing with an issue, that other person is immoral. You don't compromise with someone who's immoral. You can compromise with someone with whom you disagree, but not with someone who's immoral.
I think we have a question right down there. Wait for the microphone. Let's get the microphone to you. Go ahead.
I have two themes seem to be coming here. One is collaboration, and one is the people are not active enough. Collaboration, I can think of 2 cases of collaboration that have created a mess for this country. One was the war in Iraq. There was major collaboration there. The other one, I'm going to take issue with Governor Cuomo on this, was the bailout. The bailout ultimately worked, but at an enormous expense to the taxpayers and an enormous expense to people. Banks are not lending right now. Those were 2 cases of collaboration, 2 major cases of serious problems with our country. The other thing is people aren't getting involved. Well, maybe there's a reason. I mean, a lot of people just don't think it makes sense anymore. It feels like with the latest Supreme Court ruling, people don't really have much of a say right now. This is a corporate plutocracy we live in. The congressman ought to have lapels that say Goldman Sachs or Aetna. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why we're not collaborating. Actually, people are suffering right now. And there's a reason why we're so divided. It isn't just about hitting the middle. It's sometimes making a point. I mean, this isn't a question, this is a statement. I'm sorry, but you can respond.
So, Governor Cuomo, let me turn that into a question. Is it not just the polarization, but the fact that the policies that are taken, I think what he's saying is maybe the two biggest policies of the last 10 years, the war in Iraq, where the Democrats went along, the bailout. President Bush was just on NBC yesterday talking about how, yeah, I'll take responsibility for the top. Yes, that was my administration's idea. Don't blame President Obama. Those two big things are seen as illegitimate, and that erodes confidence.
Yeah, I disagree on the bailout. The bailout has proven to be good. The money is coming back. It worked. What they were trying to get done worked. We got a lot done. This has been lost, I think. We got a lot done because we did have Democratic majorities. You got a health care bill. Now, the health care bill is unique, I think. I'm not sure there was historically another piece of legislation that was so complex, that was so completely not understood by the American people, and I suspect the Congress. It's hard for me to believe that any congressman sat down and read the whole bill. And if they did read the whole bill, it's even harder to believe that they understood it all, because it was very complicated. But it did make advances. It did cover thousands and thousands more, millions of people that needed to be covered. And it was done. Now the Republicans are challenging it, and fine, they're going to try to have it repealed. That won't happen. And so that will be done. You do have a new law regulating finances, again, and how to deal with finance. Now, we've been through that, and because we relieved the pressure on regulation, we got into a lot of trouble. But we do have a new law there. We do have a new law that helps students who were making loans. So all of these things happened, and nobody even noticed. Why? Because the problems are so great, and the problems are great. People are suffering. These problems can be dealt with. We've dealt with them before, but you're going to have collaboration of some kind. Now, the political issue is really in the hands not of the Democrats. Obama, there's a lot of things Obama has to do differently, I think. But Obama is going to make the effort. As a matter of fact, sometimes I think he's trying too hard to make the effort now. He's acting a little bit too soft. But you're going to have to look to the Republicans. They have a choice. They can say, we're just going to see to it that he doesn't get any big legislation through. And because we're looking forward to 2012, which is tomorrow. Okay. And we want to win tomorrow. If they do that, then it's interesting. I think that will be a mistake for them politically. I'd love to hear what you think, Governor, about it politically. Or they can take a position, no, we have differences with Obama, but we will do business and we'll compromise. You have to compromise on these issues. It's the only way you get anything done. I lived for 12 years as a governor without ever having a legislature that was all mine, that agreed with me as a Democrat. They were Republicans, but we got a lot done. Hugh Carey got a lot done with a Republican government to help save New York City. So it can be done. Clinton did it, and only yesterday Clinton did it. That was just before George Bush, the second George Bush. So it can be done.
Governor Whitman?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the interesting things is I think you brought up the health care bill, and to me that is one of the areas that has fueled people's frustrations in that when you say, because I think people were slightly misled, when you say you're going to expand coverage to 32 million people, which is important and they needed it, but say it's not going to cost anymore, I think American people are saying, now wait a minute, how does this happen? How do you expand a program to include 32 million more and not cost more? And now you have small businesses. I was in Montana recently with a business owner who had about 250 employees. She said her health care costs have gone up 35%. Her employees pay 15%, so theirs went up 31%. And that's where the political rhetoric gets in the way of what the real policy is. And that's why people start to distrust their government. That's why they start to say, now, wait a minute, who's lying to me now? Because I'm not, now I don't know who to believe, because what I was told on the one hand isn't exactly what's happening. I absolutely agree with you that I think it would be a terrible mistake if Republicans just say, we're going to say no. And I don't think the American people will allow them to do that. Or if they do it, they're going to be out on their ears in 2 years. I understand what you're saying about people being angry and frustrated and upset. And I understand that, believe me. We're all a little bit angry, frustrated, and upset by what we've seen as a lack of leadership in our elected officials. But there is nobody else but us that can hold them accountable. And I hear a lot of people say, I can't do anything. I'm one person, they don't listen. What difference am I going to make? Well, there are a lot of people that are looking for new jobs now who thought that they could get away with that, and in their constituency stood up and said, you know what? We want something different. Now, they haven't been terribly articulate about what that difference was, other than some broad, we want to stop the spending and stop the deficit, stop the debt and stop the taxes. We don't want more taxes. They have certainly said that pretty clearly. But if you think back to a case where a small group of people or a minority were able to influence policy, all you have to look at is the Terry Schiavo case. I mean, that was a case where nobody won. I mean, on the merits of the case, it was a terrible thing, but the people who felt that disconnecting Terry Schiavo was murder were absolutely focused on communicating that to Congress, and they inundated with emails, with faxes, telephone calls, letters, everything. To the point where Congress acted within 4 days, and it was bipartisan. You had Democrats who were pro-choice Democrats who voted for the intervention. You had Republicans, particularly people who were running for office that year, who were up that year, who voted for that intervention, and the president came back from vacation early and signed the bill. The next day, depending on which poll you looked at, they said between 70 and 80% of the American people did not believe, whatever they thought of the merits of the case, they did not believe that Congress had the authority or the right or should have acted. That means 20 to 30% of the American people were able to get Congress to act in 4 days and the president to sign a bill. So it comes back, you can make a difference. We're the only ones who can do it, and the angrier we get, maybe the better we're at pulling up people short and saying, we got to change this. We brought it, the elected officials brought it on themselves, but I will also agree with the governor. One of the best things about being a governor, and you'd go to National Governors Association meetings, you didn't know whether the governor next to you was a Republican or Democrat. It didn't make any difference. You were talking about shared interests. You had to get things done for the people, and you didn't do health care. You didn't plow the roads. You didn't have a prison system for the Republicans or for the Democrats. You had it for the people, and you had to make it work.
Let me follow up on that, Governor Cuomo, and ask if you think there is a Democratic or a Republican way to lead as a governor in 2010. Democrats, many of them look at Chris Christie and say, whoa, he's really getting out there with the Republican agenda in state office. I don't know if they're going to look at the incoming governor of New York and say that. On the Democratic side, is there a Democratic and a Republican way to lead at this time of state fiscal crises and to rebuild confidence in government?
The 30% of the people theoretically are Democrats, 30% of the people theoretically are Republicans. That's 60%, that leaves 40% are in the middle, okay, who are not declared Democrats or Republicans. Those 40% go to vote, and a lot of them will vote Republican, a lot of them will vote Democratic. So what you really have is, I think, a population of theoretically 30% of people who are zealots about the rules and regulations of their politics. But basically, the country is somewhere in the middle. I think one of the problems is an ideology, people committed to ideologies too rigidly. Is there a place for ideology in policy making, political policy making? Yes, but it's not first place. First place should go to common sense and benign pragmatism. Now, I say benign pragmatism because if I just say pragmatism with a name like Mario Cuomo, people think you're talking about Machiavelli. And Machiavelli's bad, and Machiavelli wasn't really bad. The princes he worked for were bad, and he was telling them how to do it. But so see, and I think that there shouldn't be an all-out commitment to a certain bunch of precepts that you think are magical and will work perfectly. That's why Washington, I think, was smarter than the rest of the founding fathers when he said, don't make parties. Because if you make parties, you're starting by dividing them immediately. You're saying you're going to be this and you're going to be that. The heck with that. What we should do is throw all of the politics out and look to Lincoln for guidance.
But do you look...
Let me just make
Sure.
one point about it, because I think this is essential. One of the things we're running into is we need more clarity in our language. I said a long time ago at Yale University, you can't paint in poetry, you govern in prose. And the prose is more important than the poetry. And that's particularly apt, I think, with respect to Obama. His poetry was magical, and is. He's a great speaker. But his prose was not as clear. And we have to be more clear in our language. People don't understand the health care bill. And the governor's absolutely right. There are parts of it that even the Democrats, if they understood it, wouldn't like. And that's going to happen, and it's a good thing. It'll be reviewed. And there will be Republicans saying this is bad, that's bad, and it probably will produce a better bill in the long run. But Obama has to be clearer on the prose, and he has to tell the United States of America more closely to the hard truth, what's going on. Now, let's take one subject that nobody talks about at all, except you pointed to it at least tangentially. And that is, we collaborated all right on the war in Iraq. And that was a travesty, because Democrats voted for the war by saying that, well, if the president thinks we should have this war in Iraq, it's all right with me. That's a sin. It's a sin against the Constitution. The Constitution makes it very, very clear that war has to be declared by the legislature, by the Congress, and not by the president. That notwithstanding, ever since Vietnam, we have had war after war that indulgent people in the Congress who didn't want to make the decision, although the Constitution says it's up to them, left it to the president. The presidents are always eager to, grab hold of leadership, etc. But it's unconstitutional. Everybody knows it. The Supreme Court knows it. Well, how does the Supreme Court handle it? They won't handle it. They say it's a political issue. It's a political issue. What the hell was the case that made Bush president except a political issue? How did you go reach down and affect Florida and the whole election and give it to Bush when it belonged to Gore? That was the Supreme Court.
I'm sure Sandra Day O'Connor wishes she had a rebuttal to that tonight. But we have a question, I think, over here. Who had their hand up over here? Sir, go ahead.
You both talk about collaboration, so I'd like to ask Governor Cuomo first, do you think it's a mistake for the Democrats to choose Pelosi as minority leader in the House, given that she has been a fairly divisive person, in at least in the mindset of various politicians? And Governor Whitman, do you think that Senator McConnell's comments about wanting to gut health care and the senator's view that 2012 is a great opportunity for the Republicans, especially if they stand pat right now, do you think they're the right people to be leading the various parties, the two parties, as we try to collaborate?
Okay.
They're so nice to each
I'll
other
go
now.
first. I'm happy to go first. I think that kind of rhetoric is very, very unhelpful, and it's divisive, and it doesn't serve any purpose. What they need to do, what the American people said in this election, is start solving the problems. It's about jobs. It's about the economy. It's about our ability to live, to pay our bills, to make our rents, to be able to move forward. When you have somebody who says, we're just going to spend the next 2 years making sure that we get the presidency, and you have somebody else who in the history of, particularly in getting the health care bill, says, oh, you have to pass the bill first, then you'll know what's in it. You have two people that very clearly are not listening, I don't believe, to the American people and aren't attuned in the way they should be to their roles and responsibilities as elected leadership. And I wouldn't be at all surprised. I wouldn't mind seeing a change because I haven't. I will say though that the leader, I guess Bonner will be the leader in the House. At least he's been making some moves that I think are very good. He said, "Look, not every bill is going to be a leadership bill. I'm not going to be the one who's going to round up the votes. It's going to be left to the committee chairs and you members. If you have a bill you want to get through or you have an amendment and you think it's a good idea, you got to convince the others." You don't look to me to crack a whip and get it done the way it's been done over these last few years. And I think that's a healthy thing. I hope it works out that way. But we have to see more of that. And right now, I'm not sure with either of the leaders that you mentioned, we're going to get the kind of willingness to collaborate that we're going to need. And to get back to your point about how collaboration has failed us, let's put it that way, in two big instances. We wouldn't have a Constitution, we wouldn't have a Declaration of Independence, we wouldn't have a United States of America if some very principled people hadn't been willing to compromise. I mean, if you don't think our founding fathers didn't have violent differences up right from the very beginning about whether or not to declare independence from Great Britain, we've missed some of our history, and they compromised because they knew there was something bigger, and that's why we need to see that happen today, because there's something bigger out there, and it's about the future of this country.
And Governor Cuomo on Speaker Pelosi?
The question is, should the Democrats appoint her as minority leader? That's up to them, I think. The whether or not I think you referred to her as divisive. Did you? Is that? I'm not sure. I know what that means. She polarized by passing a number of bills, and the health care bill being the principal one among them. Without her leadership, it wouldn't have happened. Now, she thinks that's a very good thing. So do all the people who voted for it. A lot of the people on the outside looking in don't like the bill, and that's fine. But nobody really understands it. Nobody really understands it. The people I talk to, I know Pelosi, and I know a lot of the people in the House, the Democrats. And they regard her, most of them regard her as one of the best speakers ever in terms of her ability as an insider. She's another individual who, poetry and prose. She's not as strong talking to the public as she is talking to her brothers and sisters in the Congress. She really isn't a great communicator that way. But I think she's proven to be an extremely effective legislator. And let me get back to something else, the point I wanted to make with Lincoln and language and the simplicity of that issue. Language is very, very important. This argument about big government, little government is so aggravating to hear intelligent people say, well, the government's too big, the government's too little. And they say, this government's too big, and I want you to cut workers 10% to the states. I think Ron Paul said the states should cut their workers 10%. And because the workers in the public area make more money than the workers in private area. And really, where did you get those numbers? And did you judge it by the work that's done? I suspect that government has more people that do high-skilled work than the private sector does, because government doesn't dig ditches. They don't have a lot of cheap labor in government, but the private sector does. Big government, little government. What are you talking about when you say you're against big government? What part of government would you take down? Would you take the military down? Oh, no, God forbid, not if you're a Republican or an old-fashioned Republican. No, you wouldn't do that. But what would you take down? Every governor that I'm aware of in modern history, including all the Republicans like Reagan, left the biggest government alone, like Social Security and Medicare, etc. When you say big government is bad, what are you talking about? You say the spending is too high. Terrific. It is too high because we have a terrific deficit. But what you have to do is define what part of the spending you want to give up. Where do you want to cut? You get nowhere making a case simply in generalities. And it's frustrating. See, the people think in generalities because they're not educated the way our leaders are. But our leaders, at least, should be helping by being specific. We want cuts. Where should the cuts be in the deficit? There are two deficits. There's the immediate deficit you have with the budget, and there's the longer-term deficit with Social Security and Medicare. Social Security and Medicare you can push off. And you can do a lot of things with Social Security and Medicare. If you just change one thing in the Social Security law, which is to say it ends now, I think, at $100,000 or so. They stop taking the money away from you. If you let C.C. Sabathia, who makes, I don't know, $1 billion a pitch or what the hell ever he gets paid, if you made him pay Social Security on his entire income, his earned income, there would be no Social Security deficit problem. It would vanish. Those are the numbers. So we have to insist on more clarity, more common sense, better prose from our politicians.
Now, every guest in this Aspen series on leadership is being asked, how do you hope the world will be different because of your work? Will you each take a minute or two and talk about that, Governor Cuomo?
Why will the world be better by my work?
How do you hope the world will be different because of your work?
By my work? Well, I'm going to need a little bit of help on this. But I have given the world the next governor of the state of
Governor Whitman?
That's no fair. My daughter got defeated in her primary for Congress, so but she'll be back at it, and that may be the best. Seriously, I mean, I think the one thing you hope you can do by being someone like Governor Cuomo or someone like myself who has been a governor and been in a position where you at least have had an opportunity to serve is to encourage other people to get involved. And also to raise the issues about which you're passionate and that you care about the most, whether it is ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to support themselves and their family, making sure every child has a good education, or ensuring that we preserve the environment for the future generations. Those are the issues that you can raise up by speaking, but it's going to take a lot more than just two people to make sure we change the world, but you can hope you can.
Can I,
Of course.
give you a footnote to my getting serious, half serious for a moment? I think maybe one of the things I did that had a real significant impact, and a good one, and one that could be measured, is the first seatbelt law in the history of the United States of America, which was very, very hard to get. It was extremely unpopular. It's still unpopular with a lot of people, believe it or not. But it produced a funny story about Tim Russett. Tim Russett worked for me, and Tim Russett died much too early, as we all know. And Tim Russett was there when I passed the seatbelt law. I think it was '85. And it was, for us, a very big deal. I had been working on it for years. And the morning after it passed, we were in Buffalo, where Tim lived. And we had a cavalcade of automobiles, and the media car was behind mine. I had Tim get in I said, you get in the back, I'll sit in the front. of this little K car, and he says, well, why you sit in the front? And I said, well, they shoot at the back, you know, so I'm going to get in the front. And what happened is there was a big jam up. The car behind us hit us. I went forward, and my hands hit the dashboard. I had forgotten to buckle the damn seatbelt. And now this is the first day of its being active as a law. The media jumped out of the car. Timmy jumped out of the car because he was my communications guy. And the first thing I heard was the media say, "Is the governor okay?" And Timmy looked at them and said, "Thank God for the seatbelt." You know,
Very good.
see, now he never lied, but he was taught by the Jesuits. See, and the Jesuits are political, and the Jesuits teach that a lie is the distorting of the truth to someone who has the right not to be deceived. Timmy figured these bums do not have the right not to be deceived.
We had a question over there. Who had your hand up? Ma'am, right on the aisle? Yes, right there. Right there, right there.
I was going to ask you, Governor Cuomo, when you were talking about, where are they going to cut? When are we going to have leaders that talk about the fact that Social Security and Medicare are now more than 50% of the budget? We're investing all this money in people who are 65 and older as opposed to people who are 18 and younger, which are the future of our country. That's the type of leader that I want to hear from, and I'm wondering if you think we are sometime soon going to have that type of leadership in either party.
Well, what are you asking be done with the seniors and Social Security?
Getting nervous.
You said something about, well, let me.
Right, no, I'll say.
Oh,
I think that there are numerous proposals from both Democratic and
Right.
Republican sides for how we can reduce benefits in a small way, like 2% over multiple years, or raise the retirement age. There are compromises to be had. Hopefully they'll be had soon. And take that additional money and put it into investing in the future of the country so that we can actually compete with China and India and continue to be the greatest country on the earth.
Now, the commission has been appointed, as you know, by the president, and a great old Republican is on it, too, Al from Wyoming. And I'm sure they're going to deal with that. And here's something about the richest people in our country. On an issue that we're not talking about a lot, and that's the death tax, so-called, we have to do something on that because this is a critical year, and after this year, it's going to be a killer, that tax. The richest people in America showed up at the hearing in the Senate. And the spokesperson for them was Mr. Gates. Now, I've had the great privilege of meeting him, and this is the dad. I met the whole family. I did a speech for him out in Washington because he gave $30 million to his law school, and they were announcing that whole situation. Now, and he said this. He had Buffett with him and other billionaires and millionaires. And he said it's an outrage to suggest that this wealth not be taxed, and taxed a lot. The theory that says we earned this money, and we paid taxes on it already, and we shouldn't have to pay taxes on it, we can leave it all to our heirs. He says that's an absurdity. Without the United States of America, without its army, without its laws, we would not be these super wealthy people. Now, I think there's a lot of that. You've heard Buffett recently say things like that. People say it's a class warfare, the poor against the rich. And he says it is, and the rich are winning. And so I think it's entirely possible to say about Social Security and Medicare. See, Medicare, I'm confused about how it happened that the Medicaid was for poor people. And Medicare was, you didn't have to be poor. You just had to be old to get Medicare. You didn't even have to be sick to get Medicare. You got it because you were 65 years old or whatever. And I can see the Congress, both houses, and both the Democrats and Republicans agreeing, look, we have to do something about that. We can't afford that kind of generosity. Now, when they passed the Medicare bill, they didn't want to have to argue about where to cut off and who qualifies and who doesn't. So the hell with it. Everybody who gets to be old, whether they need it or not, will get these benefits. So I suspect something up there will be done, and that the richest people in this country will not object to it. They will probably support it.
Well, I think also you're saying, where are the leaders? Where are people who are going to talk about this? We do have the bipartisan commission, and it's going to be interesting to see how people react to it. But even Rand Paul, whom the governor referred to, I heard him on Sunday saying, look, we got to look at Social Security. There are things we can do with Social Security. We have to look at the military, and that's a Republican saying we've got to look at the military. And he comes from a branch of the party that's a little different than where I find myself most of the time. But those are the kinds of things that we want to hear from leaders, that we've got to put everything on the table. We are in a position now, and with our deficit and with our spending, with our tax structure, that we have to look at everything if we're going to get this under control.
Governor
And
Cuomo,
so you
let me-
hear that.
I'm sorry, were you done?
No, I was just going to say, so you're hearing that now from some of the leaders. Whether they follow through on that, that's something else, and we have to keep the pressure on them to make sure they do, but they're saying it anyway.
A follow-up question, Governor Cuomo. In New York State, a small business owner who makes $250,000 pays the same state income tax as C.C. Sabathia. And yet the governor-elect just yesterday was saying that he will not consider new taxes or changes in the tax structure at the upper level to deal with the fiscal crisis in New York State. Do you have a problem at home?
I want to be clear on what you're saying, that his position, as I understand it, is he will not raise taxes on the rich people or anybody else. And I think that's a proper position at the moment. Taxes are another subject that needs explanation. Some politicians have gotten away with the notion that if you raising taxes is always a bad idea. And it's usually a bad idea by Democrats in charge. Here's some history, and it's going to be very relevant because we haven't discussed it tonight, but they're going to be discussing a lot what you do with the Bush tax cuts before the end of the year, and we're getting very close to the end of the year. And the Bush tax cuts, of course, are $4 trillion involved in those tax cuts. And how do you handle that? Well, Reagan and George Bush, okay? George Bush won. Reagan was known as the great tax cutter. And my years as governor, part of them were his years as president. And I got to know him very well in a whole lot of ways. And he gave the biggest tax cut in history. He dragged us down to 28%, I think, was the top under him. And his argument was supply side. George Bush had run against him in the primaries and said supply side is voodoo economics. But he married the witch doctor and became vice president. So you've got Reagan and Bush. Reagan gave that big tax cut and then discovered that the deficit was terrible and raised taxes 6 times after that, so that the total of his raises in taxes was equal to the tax cut. And nobody seems to remember that. George Bush, who was his vice president, had decided during the vice presidency to read my lips, no new taxes. If I become president, no new taxes. And Reagan told him, you're wrong, you're going to have to do it. And he had to do it. And he raised taxes almost $1 billion and brought it from 28 back to 32. Then comes Clinton. Clinton now promises Jesse Jackson and me in a march on Washington that if I win, we're going to do $200 billion in infrastructure. Great. Jobs, we need it. The governors all need infrastructure all the time. But Bob Rubin calls in about the 9th month and says, the president can't do that. He'll do a little bit of infrastructure, but he's got to do another tax increase like the one that Reagan and Bush did before him. And that's how he wound up balancing the budget eventually. Okay?
Does this story end in Albany?
Yeah, no, the point is this. To say that tax increases are always bad is foolish. Republicans have proven that. There is a time for tax increases. This is not the time for tax increases. This is the time for stimulating the economy. This is the time for taking whatever wealth you can and get it into creating jobs. And now we should all keep our fingers crossed that Bernanke knows what he's doing when he spends $800 billion in buying bonds from the government and turning that, creating new dollar bills, in effect, because we desperately need the stimulation. I hope it works. A lot of people think it won't. But $800 billion is being pushed into and to say now that you're going to leave the tax cuts that Bush gave, and remember, when Bush passed those tax cuts, if he thought that they were permanent things that were good for this country, why did he put a limitation on it? Because he knew that, that helped him get it passed at the time. Was, well, it's not forever, it's only for this period of years. And let's face it, when you get to it, nobody will have the guts to undo it.
But it's not, by your logic, in effect, a tax increase for today, in today's economy, to let it rise back up for the wealthy?
It is, because that's what Bush gave us. Yes, Bush gave us a tax that dies this year. And it dies. And you let it die. So if you're going to tell me I'm responsible for letting it die, yeah, then I'm responsible. But if you want to be truly accurate, the guy who passed it is responsible for letting it die this year.
Governor Whitman?
Well, obviously, I have a slightly different opinion on the relative benefits of tax increases and tax cuts. And one of the things that we have to remember, while there is, I agree with you, there's with the governor in saying there is a time for them, I do agree that this would be the absolute worst time to raise taxes because of the need to stimulate the economy. When I became governor, one of the things I ran on was cutting the income tax, 30% over 5 years, and started retroactively in my first inaugural address to cut it 5%. We saw, because my predecessor had raised taxes on everything, I mean literally down to toilet paper, which had what really infuriated people. And over the 4 years we had lost, that he'd been governor, we lost 350,000 jobs because we were not competitive from a tax structure point of view. That was the reality. It took 7 years, but by the time I left with the tax cuts, we had had 450,000 new jobs created. I didn't create them. Private sector created them. Government can create jobs, but not the long-lasting ones that people are looking for to support their families, and where you get into a problem with the increase in the public sector jobs, because most of our budgets, at least I know in New Jersey, and probably true in New York, we only have about 17% that's discretionary. The rest is all formula driven. It's all the benefits, it's the contracts, it's the health care. And those are the things that are going to be the ones that we leave for our children and our grandchildren to pay, because they become enormously expensive. So it is important to watch how government grows, and I always looked on tax cuts as a way for me to say to the legislature, we can't spend this money on that program, gang. We don't have it anymore. We're not going to have it. But also to send a message to the private sector that we wanted them here and we were going to be competitive without putting ourselves in a position where we couldn't afford anything, and we left with a balanced budget and $1 billion surplus.
We're almost out of time. I asked you the Aspen softball question before about how you think your work left the world a better place. Do either of you look back and think there was anything you did as governors that inadvertently helped set the stage for today's fiscal crises? For example, critics in both states say too much borrowing was a failing of both states, going way back to defer costs. With the benefit of hindsight, is there anything like that you would identify, Governor Whitman?
It's hard because I get blamed a lot for the borrowing. because one of the things I did very early on was bring onto the books debt that was being carried off the books. And I just thought we ought to look at it as being debt is debt, and so that was the debt. We borrowed, I believe, appropriately. We borrowed for capital programs, not for operating. My successor did that, and he borrowed for operating costs and got taken to court, and it was deemed unconstitutional because that's not what you borrow for. But borrowing, if it is for a program, I don't see why today's taxpayers should have to bear the full burden of building a bridge or fixing a road that is going to be enjoyed done right for generations to come. You can afford to spread that over time, and that's an appropriate way to use it. So I'm not sure I would say that that was the big, I mean, it is a big problem. There's no question that the borrowing is a big problem, but a lot of that has occurred. I like to think that I wasn't the one who did it all.
Governor Cuomo, same question for New York and you.
It's a very elusive question for me. I'll need more time to study it, I think.
Is politics more broken in New York and New Jersey than it is in other states? We always hear about these surveys that come out and say New York is the most dysfunctional state in the nation, in Albany and things like that. Governor, briefly.
Very hard for me to comment on all the other states. You know, I really don't know. New York is New York, and so everything that happens here is larger than, you know, it happens elsewhere. And we just get more publicity than the rest of the world. I think, frankly, right now, the last couple or few years, it's been worse than at any time in my history. And that's very long indeed. I came in 1975. So just measured against ourselves and our own history, where this is the worst period I can think of. And I think, frankly, the job of the next governor is going to be the hardest governor's job in the, I can't imagine, not even during the Depression, the governor having a more difficult job than Andrew's going to have, trying to deal first with a budget that's, I think, $9 billion out of whack or something like that. But yeah, it's very bad, and maybe the worst ever for New York. I'm not going to compare it, though, to Jersey and Connecticut, et cetera.
Well, we get the budgets done on time, so that's a good thing. That would make New Jersey a little bit more functional. And actually, in fact, this governor, if you notice, he has a Democrat. Democrats control both houses of the legislature, and yet he's gotten a lot of things done with them. So I would have to say that I think we're getting to be in a pretty good place in the state of New Jersey. That can all fall apart in a heartbeat. It's easy for it to happen. But right now, they seem to be working together. He's got a good working relationship with the Democrat leadership, and that's enabled him to get some things done that might not have happened otherwise.
And Governor Cuomo, I just want to give you the opportunity to tell us, are you proud 1 week after the election of your son?
You know, that's the toughest question of the night for me, because we're not comfortable. I won't speak for Matilda, but I'm not comfortable, but, you know, proud. I think we're grateful. You know, you have to be grateful for the good luck of having you know, a good, strong family, and the gifts that Andrew has are all a matter of good luck. They're all from a source that goes way beyond us, and we admire what he's done a great deal because of the way he's using those gifts. He is spectacularly gifted. I mean, I can say that as his father. I know. No, he is. He really is. And he could have gone and made himself wealthy, and that wouldn't have been hard for him. He knows how tough the problems are going to be, and still he wants to do it. So you've got to admire that. I think, frankly, without being cornball about it, given that we have in our marriage four immigrant parents who came here from another part of the world, without any skills, without any money, without any friends, and one was a laborer, my father, and the other was a carpenter, Matilda's father. And to think that in one generation they produced a governor, and then in a second generation they produced another governor, you got to say only in America. And so if there's anything to be proud of, it's proud of this country and allowing this kind of thing to happen.
And will you? So on that note, please thank Governors Cuomo and Whitman.